Mike Munoz, a district ranger on the Rocky Mountain District with the Helena, Lewis and Clark National Forest. And been there since '99. Have the pleasure of working with a lot of really good folks throughout the complex. And as you've heard throughout history and currently today, we work a lot across our arbitrary boundaries. So I'll try to add something to this here. You've heard some great stuff from a number of people. And one of the things I want to point out real clearly is, as Dave pointed out earlier, as well as George, that the wilderness program is really the foundation of how we've been managing fire and managing it well in terms of its benefit to the landscape. And that is a key for the wilderness, is that we're trying to manage lightning-caused fires as nearly as possible for their natural role in the environment of the wilderness. And we're starting to extend beyond that, though, because on the Rocky Mountain District, there's a big challenge, as Deb pointed out, and Matt has pointed out yesterday and today, that there's a lot of opportunity for us to accept fires coming over from spotted bear over the Continental Divide, and we have had several over the time frame of 1980 through 2015. And it's a lot more challenging to even take a look at trying to keep what we did in the past in terms of trying to keep fire in the wilderness. Someone was using the term fire escaping the wilderness, and I cringe at hearing that, because there's a lot of benefits that can happen beyond the wilderness. And that's something that we're trying to work on when it comes to the Rocky Mountain District. And so when you take a look at that and you look at 1988, it gave us a lot of opportunities, and we're taking advantage of those opportunities. And in 2013, we had a reoccurrence of fire within the Gates Park perimeter, and it was entirely within the Gates Park perimeter. And we were able to manage that quite well with very little activity. When you take a look at the Moose Ridge fire last year, 2015, most of the activity was basically structure protection. We were taking advantage of an earlier fire called Biggs Flat Fire, 2001. Those fires in '88 have also given us some opportunity where we're looking beyond the wilderness boundary. And for example, when you take a look at the Canyon Creek fire, this big green one here, we're starting to look at the forest boundary, and we're currently doing an analysis on 10,000 acres in the Nunn Wilderness where we're going to do management ignition. And we're doing that so that future fires have less of a chance of getting beyond the forest boundary, so that we don't have to take unnecessary actions. One of the other key things that we've been doing, or that we did starting in 2001, was the South Fork Sun prescribed fire in the Scapegoat Wilderness. And again, we started that 16,000 acre project with the thought that we want to be able to manage lightning-caused fires into the future. And if we're going to be able to do that, we have to be able to protect the values at risk in the benchmark drainage, which ran essentially the same length as the Scapegoat. And essentially, what we were able to do is treat those areas with management ignition, aerial ignition, and then that provided a lot of opportunity in the Danaher country for the Spotted Bear District to start managing and allowing fire to play its natural role as nearly as possible. So we've been taking steps to continue to move forward in terms of how we manage fire on the landscape. And one of the neat things that really didn't hit me till I was sitting in here is we had a resource benefit fire up in the Badger 2 Medicine country, which is not in wilderness. It's beyond the wilderness boundary. We actually managed that fire as best we could, but it was a first entry. And that first entry went 55,000 acres and resulted in Hart Butte being evacuated. And we were fortunate that on the reservation, there's a lot of change in fuel type, a whole bunch of aspen that made a big difference in not allowing that fire to get to Hart Butte. But it was really neat to know that in '88, we were given an opportunity with the fires that were managed from lightning, and now we're providing an opportunity to somebody in the future to manage fire up in the Badger 2 Medicine country. So one of the other things that we're starting to work on is, in terms of challenges, again, a Biggs Flat fire in 2001, I would say, except for Ahorn, we took more action to keep that fire within the wilderness than we did on any other fires. Full Creek fire was a 62,000 acre fire, and we took far less action on that than we did with one of our first wildland fire use events or resource benefit fires. And so the challenge now is we have these areas that haven't seen fire 20 miles easily north to south since 1919. And the day's coming when they will burn. And so we're starting to have discussions with landowners because we're thinking about what ends up happening when we try to take action in timber, especially in steep topography that is not successful, and how much exposure that provides to people in aircraft as well as people on the ground, when we have a lot of opportunity on the forest boundary to take a look at changes in fuel type that would be a lot easier to take actions on. And so we have started discussions with our ranch owners from the Letterman Ranch, and we're going to continue down south towards several other ranches. I won't say all the names because you won't know them. But we are starting to have those discussions so that we can start managing fire outside of the wilderness as well. And we're going to have some situations that are going to be very, very challenging, much like Spotted Eagle fire was. But we are looking at providing those opportunities for people in the future. So one of the other things, and Deb touched on it really well, is the aftermath of fire. The blowdown that we're seeing in terms of trails and their impact and the reoccurrence. We could clear some of those trails 4 times in one season. And that's all we're able to focus on is clearing trails. So doing tread work and drainage work is getting very challenging. We try to take advantage of doing some work during the actual fire so that we could charge that to H code or P code, whatever it is. And we're able to do that in some scenarios, but it's not that easy to keep up with. The other thing is that there is the user public that we're hearing more and more complaints in terms of their ability to camp and to find areas where they can have shade as well as stock water and feed. And there's plenty of feed now, but there's a lot more snags that make a lot of areas unsafe to camp in. And so there are impacts there that it's tough to mitigate when you're trying to allow fire to play its natural role on the landscape. Let's see. The other thing that was talked about is climate change. And for me, that was a perplexing thing in the last couple of years as I think about how are we going to continue to manage fire with some of the changes that we're seeing, where we're seeing very low amounts of snowpack. We're seeing warmer conditions 30 to 45 days earlier in the spring. We're seeing conditions lasting for fires to go into November, where we used to end in the middle of September with season-ending events. And that's stretching us. It's putting us at a lot more exposure in terms of monitoring fires and taking whatever necessary actions we have. But I finally arrived at the fact that if we don't have more fires in the next 10 to 15 years, when we continue to get hotter and drier, we're definitely going to see a lot more fire. And if we have fires that might prove to be self-limiting, helping to reduce not only smoke but spread and intensity, we'll have a better chance in terms of what's happening out on the ground versus what might have been present between the 1930s and 1980s. Jim Flint has some good maps out here that break out, I think it's 1850 to 1910 or something, and then you get into the 1930s through 1980 when there was no fire activity hardly. I mean, just nothing. If we had continued to be nothing, we'd be in a very bad spot today in terms of climate change. We'd be looking at the 300,000 acre fires in the near future. So I think we got ourselves in a very good spot in terms of what we'll be able to do in the next 10 to 15 years. So basically, that's all I was going to share. And if there's any questions. Yes, Norm?
On the Heritage Act, what's the fire management plan for the acreage that came in under that?
Fire management plan will follow the Bob Marshall plan where it's part of the Bob Marshall. It'll follow the Scapegoat Danaher plan where it's part of the Scapegoat. And there are 2 plans. There's the 1981 Danaher Scapegoat and there's the 1983 Bob Marshall that covers the Great Bear. You were both right, you just were both wrong too. So it does follow those plans. And that was one of the interesting things with the Heritage Act. We had 5 additional wilderness areas added in 2014. And a lot of people said, all you're going to do is burn it up. We don't want it to be wilderness. And you know, it still comes down to values at risk. It comes down to time and location. And we had a fire within one of the new wilderness areas in 2015, the Benchmark fire. We immediately recognized it was within a half mile of several structures, and we knew that we needed to put that out. And we put it out. Primarily too, because we're not just relying on fire. You look at the Benchmark area, and we have a hazardous fuels project there that's both forest account, meaning Forest Service going out and thinning, and we're going to do prescribed fire in there. And we're also doing commercial harvest with RY Timber out of Townsend. And they're going to start this fall and winter and be done by the spring with prescriptions that we have that are specifically focused on rec residence locations. We have 48 rec residents up there. They're in neighborhoods, 10s and 20s. And then we have 3 lodges and resorts as well as other Forest Service facilities, including cabins and hay barns and campgrounds. And so we recognize that there's some things we need to do in the Benchmark corridor, because the day is coming when Benchmark will ignite and we won't be catching it. There's only one way in and out, and at some point we're going to make sure that it's life first for our fire personnel first, and we're not going to do things that are going to be foolish. So I kind of overextended that answer, but anything else?
How about the sunburn?
The South Fork Sun?
Yeah.
Oh,
Is that completely implemented? Or?
yeah, I'll go in a little more detail on that. I just touched on it earlier. The decision was made in 2001. Fortunately, we had Brad McBratney leading that effort and doing the analysis, and we actually got through without any appeals, believe that or not. And Norm Camrud and Brad, along with a number of folks, helped implement that. Starting in 2003, we were able to burn 4,000 acres, essentially a large black line on the ridges of Patrol Ridge and Hotley Ridge. And then we had to wait until 2009 for the next opportunity, which was a 1,000-acre knob that sat right at the confluence of the South Fork Sun and Hotley Creek. And in that area, we get all these vector winds that easily could push fire out of that drainage and into the Benchmark area. So we needed to really secure that 1,000 acres along with the other 4,000. And then in 2011, we were able to implement the entire project, completing it. And with that too, I want to point out that again, we were still managing fire to allow it to play its natural role. So when we especially did the last phase of that, which was about 10,000 acres from aerial ignition, we took what we got because it's wilderness. We didn't go back and try to fill in. We didn't decide, well, this didn't burn enough or that didn't burn enough. We didn't put our own, impose our own human deciphering on it, I guess. We said, we're going to take what we get. We have a lighting pattern that we're going to try to contain. We were able to, and if some areas didn't burn, they didn't burn. If they burned, they did. And fortunate for us, most of that treatment was just really good. You had a great mosaic. There were probably patches of anywhere from 500 to 1,000 acres that were complete stand replacement. But in 2007, even before we finished implementation, that Hotley reef that I talked about helped stop ahorn from hooking around and getting into Benchmark. And in 2012, it helped when we had the Idaho City complex, thinking back to '94, the Elbow Pass complex. It ran into that, and all we had to do was monitor it. We didn't have to go in and do any suppression activities whatsoever. So it was very beneficial. And I just see that constantly something that's going to reoccur and reoccur if we're able to stay on the mark. So, any other questions? Thank you.